I was rewatching Howl's Moving Castle recently, and I was struck by how many of the movie elements would sort of lend themselves really nicely to a quilt, including this tapestry here on the wall behind Sophie. As she tries to remove that plane from the castle, you know, the one right there, it would make a really great mini quilt. There are also a couple of small details here and there that would make a really interesting quilt design. And of course, I have to mention the jacket that Howl is wearing when he first meets Sophie. Mwah, that would be such a great quilt. Now, I've never made any type of fan art before, so I think for my very first piece, I'm going to embrace simplicity and choose a pattern that would be easy for people of all different skill levels in case there are others out there who are interested in making a Howl's Moving Castle quilt. So let me tell you about the mysterious transforming quilt that shows up several times in Howl's Moving Castle. Okay, so I might have exaggerated a little bit because the quilt isn't exactly mysterious, and while it does transform, I don't think it does so on purpose. My theory is that since so many illustrators and animators worked on this movie, some wires got crossed along the way. So I think there was probably a basic brief on what the quilt was supposed to look like, and each artist sort of just interpreted it just a little bit differently. Each transformation or iteration has a sort of peachy color palette, though Quilt 1 has a darker color in the background and a lighter color in the foreground, so that's a little bit different. They're each a variation of an orange peel pattern, but Quilt 3's orange peels are much, much narrower. I personally prefer the plumper variation on Quilt 2. And finally, the embellishments are all different. So Quilt 1 appears to have some trapunto, adding a little bit of volume to the motif, the orange peel motif. Quilt 2 has some extra applique on top of the bigger pieces of applique. And Quilt 3, the most elaborate of the three, has extra stitching, fabric-covered buttons, and I think maybe even, you might call that tufting. I tried to stick as close as I could to the color palette in the movie, but I was sort of limited by what was available at my fabric store. So I ended up coming home with these two fabrics. So it's definitely not a perfect match. I did pre-wash these fabrics because it is of dubious quality. It's definitely not a brand name. So I did a little zigzag stitch on the raw edges and I threw it in my wash. Nothing special. I didn't use any sort of anything fancy. Just whatever I use on my laundry. And it did shrink a little bit, but not nearly as much as I was expecting. So that was a nice surprise. Looks like it's time for a cuddle break, because this one won't leave me alone. So this is my main fabric. I'm going to be cutting my petal shapes, or my orange peel shapes, out of this one. And I have approximately 2-ish yards. And then over here is my background fabric, and I have a little over 2.5 yards of that one. At one point, I hung up this fabric over my closet door just to get it out of the way, and now I have all of these really annoying white smudges on this side of the fabric. Luckily, it's two-sided because it's a solid fabric. So I should be able to strategically avoid all of these marks, but still really annoying. I had no idea my closet door would do that. Howl's Moving Castle is a story that is absolutely full of transformation, and I'm not just talking about character development that any good movie has, I'm talking about dramatic, physical transformations. So, first and foremost is Sophie. She's cursed and she physically ages several decades. And then, of course, there's Howl, who has this sort of uneasy transition between a very vain wizard and this sort of feathered beast. There is the Witch of the Waste. She has a couple pretty significant transformations. And then lastly, Howl's castle goes through several significant transformations. So all things considered, I think this quilt is a good choice just to fit the theme of the movie. Originally, I was thinking about making a large bed-sized quilt, but my imagination just kept snagging on that idea of transformation, and who in the real world transforms more than a baby? So from baby to toddler to child, it's a little bit of real life magic right there that anyone can see. So long story short, I've decided to make this quilt baby-sized or child-sized, so not a full-sized bed quilt. So I have a basic plan for what I'm going to do, but I need to make a few samples before I start cutting into my fabric because I don't know what size I want my blocks to be yet. So I've got the biggest one here is for a 7-inch block. This is for a 5-inch block, and then I have a little one for a 3-inch block, which I think is the cutest one, but it would be so much more work compared to a big guy like this. So I will need to do a couple samples. I also want to do a couple experiments with Trapunto. And for those of you who don't know what Trapunto is, same. I have a very loose idea about what it is. I did this sample, and I did an applique on top, and then I stuffed it with fiberfill or what is it called? I think it's called fiberfill. And it didn't work out quite how I was hoping. I think I overstuffed it, for one. But it also really warped my block. So if I were doing several blocks and I wanted to keep them nice and straight and tidy, this one got really warped from the Trapunto, and it would be really messy to put a bunch of warped blocks together. So I'm going to have to do a little bit more research to see if this is Trapunto or if there's an easier way to do it. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to support this channel, check out my merch shop and buy me a coffee page. Okay, let's get back to the video. Okay, let's look at the samples I made. And I want to talk about the size of my orange peels or my petals or whatever you want to call them first. So, without a doubt, I'm going to use this size for my quilt. It's just going to be a lot quicker, and I won't have to cut as many pieces of batting for the Trapunto. This is my absolute favorite size. It's just so cute. And if I had more patience, I would make the whole quilt out of this size. But I don't have that patience. Instead, I think what I'm going to do is make a mini quilt. If I have some scraps left over, make a mini quilt, and that would be a lot of fun, I think. I think this size is also very approachable, but I'm just leaning more heavily towards the big one. Now for the layout, I was assuming I was going to do this layout. Don't look at this one. I was messing around with how I was positioning on the block, and I just did that one randomly for no reason. But anyway, I was imagining I would lay them out like this, more as a 4-petal flower than a traditional orange peel. It resembles quilt 1 and quilt 2 a little better. See, there's like that separation between the 4 patches. And I was originally going to do it that way, but when I was quilting this little piece, I realized how inconvenient it would be to do that on a whole quilt. So basically, let me get a pin. When I was quilting this little patch, I was outlining the shape like this, very more neatly than this. Then at this point here, I would knot my threads and bury them in the quilt. And then I would move on to the next petal. I guess I could have buried them all at the same time, but I was doing it one at a time. But I was realizing if I did that on a whole quilt, I would have to sew, stop here, pivot my entire quilt, sew, stop here, pivot my entire quilt, and then sew again. And then if I didn't bury it right away, I'd have to make sure I didn't sew over my ends, which would be a huge hassle if I was doing that on an entire quilt. So instead of this layout, I think I'm going to go with the more traditional orange peel layout like this, which is more similar to quilt number 3. So to quilt this piece, I would start at the edges and I would go serpentine like this. More neat, of course, more even, and that way I could quilt it from edge to edge. And then to do the other side of those, I would just go and serpentine the other way neatly, and I can just do it edge to edge. I had also been planning to do some hand quilting down the centers of each of these motifs, but because there's so much batting in there, I was having a really hard time getting my needle to rock, so I just went ahead and did a machine quilted line down the middle. And you know what? I like it. So I think I'm probably going to do that on my main quilt too, and so I can do a very similar, just edge to edge, straight down like this. And then for the ones going this way, edge to edge, straight down. So that is my plan so far for layout and for quilting, but let's talk about the trapunto now. I found a great video on YouTube that covered several different ways to do trapunto, and of course, I wrote it down somewhere, now I can't find it. But I'm going to try to link to that video in the description of this video, so go check it out if you're interested in trapunto. If you want to see how I did the trapunto, I'll show you later on in the main quilt, but what I want to show you right now is that these 2 pieces have 2 pieces of batting to fill in, and these 2 have 1 piece. And there is a little bit of a noticeable difference between the 2. I like the fluffier one, but that's the problem, because it's not actually as fluffy as I was expecting. It's dense, so you can definitely feel a difference between this is 1 layer and then this is 2 layers in the applique and the layer in the overall little mini quilt, and it definitely puffs up or adds volume to the applique shape, but it's not fluffy like I wanted it to be, which was a little disappointing. This one has 1 layer, 1 extra layer under the applique shape, so it just barely raises up. This one has 2 layers, and it's just not doing what I was hoping it would do, and I think that all comes down to the batting. Basically, I was really excited about using up these batting scraps I hang on to. Every time, you add that little extra around the edges of a quilt, I save that, and I use them in different little projects, but I have a lot of it, and I was excited to use that up. But it's sort of that flat stuff that you see a lot in quilts. But what I need is high loft batting, which is going to be a little bit of a challenge because my favorite local quilt shop doesn't really have a large batting selection. Luckily, I do have several quilt shops in my area. They each sort of have their own specialty, but I'm going to have to go and take a look around and see if any of them actually have a high loft batting. I just need like a little, maybe a crib-sized piece of batting to fill in all of these shapes. And of course, it's always fun to go to the quilt shop, and it seems like a really nice little treat to actually do a little shop hop around my area. Oh, I almost forgot to mention, okay, I had a lot of fun using prints for this for these samples. I have some batik and some prints. I love a gold print. I don't know why. And that's not to say that I don't like the simplicity of the solid fabrics. I like the simplicity and the frugality of solids, actually. But it got me thinking about what the quilt would look like with some nice visual texture from some prints and things. So I'm going to put together a few mock-ups using some batiks, some prints, maybe some ombre here and there, and also a quilt that has the orange peel, but also something going on in the background. So I'm going to work those up, and then I'm going to include them at the end of this video. So make sure to stick around to the end to see those different mock-ups and get some other ideas if you're interested in doing this pattern. I've been making pretty good progress on my blocks so far. I have about 10 that are completely sewn down. I have the extra fabric cut out of the back, and then I have about 10 that are just glued down. They haven't been sewn yet. But I need to make 36 blocks, so I'm still in the process of making my little applique shapes. Not that little. And I'm using my favorite applique method called freezer paper applique. It is my favorite because these templates are reusable. They stick right onto your fabric. You can iron them right on, and they just last and last. And the more gentle you are with them, the longer they last. When I do freezer paper applique, I like to do 2 layers of freezer paper because it just holds up so much better than just one single layer. So here, this one has been used at least 3 times. And you can tell it's been used, but it's still working just fine. To do freezer paper applique, you need a few things. So first of all, some of this spray starch. Really, really good stuff. A brush of some kind. This is an old makeup brush that I never used and I repurposed. And then I have this seam ripper. It is not sharp at all, so I've just repurposed it as a stiletto. So any kind of stiletto you have would be good. We're just trying to keep our fingers from being burnt. You also need freezer paper, of course, and a nice hot iron. So first step, this is my favorite step, and I can't explain why, but you spray the spray starch right into your cap. Not so much that the bubbles are going to go over the side. And if they're close to going over the side, you can just knock them down with your brush. So you've got a nice little well of starch there. And then I like to move my starch well away from my iron because I'm paranoid, I guess. So you're going to take your wet brush and run it along the edge of your fabric in your seam allowance. The wetter you get it, the more stiff I feel like it is, but it also means you have to iron it a little bit more. It's going to take a little bit longer to get it dry again. Also, if you do use a lot of starch, it might start to leak onto your edges and make your edges soft, so just keep an eye on that. But 2 layers really helps. So the next step is I use my little stiletto to hold this corner down, and then I use the edge of my iron to sort of lift up that fabric and start moving it towards the edge, like that. I'm going to move this out of the way. And then I'll go back and actually push it over. And I don't use this too much except at the corners and to just keep my piece in place. You could try using your fingers, but I am very clumsy and I end up burning myself, so a stiletto it is. So I'm just going to pay attention to keeping it even, make sure and making sure that the fabric doesn't fold or pleat or anything. You want a nice smooth edge. Look at that. Okay, and then I'll turn it around and do the other side. I will say one downside to this method is that it really stains my ironing board cover. So I often will do a round of applique and then immediately wash the ironing board cover just so I don't get too much buildup, hopefully. And I try not to do it all in one spot, so I'll move around my ironing board just to spread the stain, I guess, so it doesn't look too obvious. So now in this corner, it's even more important that I make sure it stays in place so I don't lose my sharp point. And just start pushing like so. And at this corner, I'm going to be extra careful too. And you'll see if your piece isn't laying flat, if it's curling up like that, it just means you're not done pressing it yet. But make sure you move your iron around because you can scorch your freezer paper template. And then they become less reliable and not as easy to use. You'll notice at the points that there are these little flags. Don't cut those off. As you sew the applique down, you're going to just push it underneath your applique and sew that side. In fact, if you wanted to, you could pre-press it so that it's underneath the piece. But don't cut those because if you cut them, your tips will fray. So generally, I would leave that to set for a while, and sometimes I even put something heavy on it. There's not a good reason for that, I just do. But when you're ready to take the piece out, you just fold back one of the seam allowances. You just pull it right off, okay? And it looks a little messy, but it holds that fold really well. At this point, I just like to reinforce it a little bit, the fold. So I'll lay it flat and give it another press. Just real quick, because I want it to lay flat on the piece of fabric that I'm going to iron it onto. Okay, here's the square that I'm going to sew it onto. I'm going to fold it in half diagonally, and I'm just going to finger press a quick crease just in the corner. And I like to hold the tip down so I'm trying not to do any stretching because this is on the bias. I'll do that on both sides. I used to do it all the way across, but I feel like it's a good way to press it out of shape. And here is the square up ruler I've been using to place my applique pieces. I know that I want right about there, so I'm lining up on the crease to the corner, and then I'll place my applique piece like this. So I'll place this corner and then make sure that this point ends up on that crease. So this is the point where I get out my Elmer's glue and my precision tip, and I would glue in the seam allowance, not on the edge, but within the seam allowance. So I'm going to be aiming sort of towards the middle, not the edge, because I don't want to have to sew through any glue, because it's hard to get through with when you're hand sewing and your finger ends up starting to hurt, especially if you don't have a thimble. And then I would put that down, pat it into place, and let it air dry. You could also heat set it if you feel like it, but I like to air dry mine. I think this is a great pattern for beginner quilters because you don't need to do a bunch of complicated cutting and quilt math and putting together a huge palette of fabrics. You just need 2 colors, and once you put everything together, it looks so much more complicated than it actually is. And this stitch is super easy, and it becomes even easier if you have a nice matching thread color, because you can be pretty messy and it just blends right in. And all you really need is some patience, because this is going to take some time. I can usually get about 3 or 4 done in an hour. So just put on a movie or one of your favorite television shows, or my favorite is actually audiobooks. I've been listening to the Howl's Moving Castle audiobook, and there are some differences in it. The beginning is pretty similar with some added family drama, but there comes a point about halfway through where there is a big twist that makes it completely different from the movie. And also, there's something a little extra going on with Sophie, and that's all I'm going to say. No spoilers. I'm going to leave a link to the audiobook and the movie in the description of this video if you want to check it out. For those of you who might want to do this quilt for yourself, I whipped up a few templates. So this is the size that I ended up using, and I put a recommendation of what size block to do. And down here I wanted to mention that you remove the seam allowance if you're going to do freezer paper applique or raw edge applique, but you leave the seam allowance if you're going to do traditional turned edge applique. So that's this line right here, that's the seam allowance. And this is in 3 sizes. So that's the size I did. This is the middle size, finishes at 4.5 inches about. And this is my favorite size, the smallest one, and it finishes at about 3 inches. But I just want to clarify, these are going to be a digital download on my merch shop, which means you're going to need a printer if you want to use them. And also, if you don't like them, you can't return them. You can't return digital products. So that will be about, I think I'm going to list it for $4.50, and you're going to get all 3 sizes. And I also made some templates for a quilt that I made last year. I was calling it my woven ribbons quilt in my head, but I don't think I ever mentioned what I was calling it in that video. Anyway, there's 4 sizes for this one. So this is 2 inches finished, we have 4.5 inches finished, 6 inches finished, and 7 inches finished. So the first 2 are my favorite sizes because these will work well with a charm pack and these will work well with a jelly roll. These will also be listed together for about probably $4.50. I haven't decided, but I'm thinking $4.50 for all 4 of them. These are just templates. There aren't going to be any extra instructions. So I'm assuming that the people who are buying these will know how to applique and they'll know how to do foundation paper piecing. This is the woven ribbons mini quilt that I was talking about. At the end of each of these ribbons, that's the foundation paper piecing pattern. So that's the template that I was showing you. And I just love this quilt. It's near and dear to me. I think I'm probably going to make it again later this year, but much bigger. This quilt became very frustrating towards the end. I mean, I've never had to rip out so many stitches during the quilting process. After a while, I got so frustrated, I started cutting corners. So this particular quilt is not the best representation of my quilting skill. And I blame it all on the Trapunto. I mean, it did help add volume similar to the quilt I was referencing, but in the end, it was just such a headache. Despite all of that, I am happy with how it turned out. It's not perfect, not even close, but it's cozy and it's eye-catching, and I just find it very pleasing. Now, as for the fan art of it all, if the goal was to replicate something as accurately as possible, I think I failed. But if fan art is supposed to be about finding inspiration in art that you admire, then I definitely succeeded. Technically, I'm not completely done. I want to add a bit more quilting, but I want to do a safety sample first so I don't mess anything up. I'm also going to make this tag for the back of the quilt, and I'm going to use some orange embroidery floss to outline the flames. But for now, I'm going to leave it right here so I can upload this video this weekend. Now here are some mock-ups for your viewing pleasure. Thanks for spending time with me today, Quilters. If you want to support this channel and help me buy supplies and materials for future videos, please visit my Buy Me a Coffee page linked in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss upcoming videos. And I'll see you again real soon. Bye!